Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Waffles, I'm talking about the 2004 album from Marc Leclair, Musique pour trois femmes enceintes. Sorry if I screwed that up. Okay, see, this is the kind of project I actually like getting from Patreon requests. These kind of, one-off releases that wouldn't make sense in, a larger series and I wouldn't ordinarily get a chance to cover, but still deserve some kind of coverage. Marc Leclair is an artist to which a full series would not really make sense. Technically, this one album is the only thing this Canadian artist has ever put out, at least under his own name. He has remained more active under his main alias, Acouphene, under which he has also only released one album, but also a myriad of other EPs and singles. And he's also put out a few other projects under other aliases like Horror Inc., among others. His discography is a little sparse and disorganized, a la Mark Pritchard, I guess. But as far as I can tell, this project here is his single biggest claim to fame. While his stuff as Acouphene leans more on the funkier, glitchier, and more lighthearted side of French house, combined with lower-key micro house, and is much more sample-heavy, this project is a lot more of a minimalistic ambient techno project. And for those who are into this particular kind of ambient techno, it seems to have held up in many circles as a proper classic, and one of the best examples of what this genre had to offer in the mid-2000s. I'd known it existed for years. I first found out about it through someone else's, top 100 electronic albums of all time list. The one that had every Plastic Man album on it. And this album managed to rank all the way at number 5 on that list. And this album even almost got Patreon requested a different time before. I think the first guy who ever sent me a request gave me a choice between this project and the Orbs Orbis Terrarum. I went with the latter since I was more familiar with it, and I didn't know when a proper series on them would come. Also, that was back in the days when I thought Patreon requests were something that I could get motivated to finish quickly. The guy who requested it this time also gave me a choice between several other projects in a similar vein, also including Gridlock's Formless and Trentemüller's The Last Resort. Both of which I would have been interested in covering, and that was a pretty difficult decision. But I ended up picking this one since it'd been brought up to me that one time before by an actual requester. So, yeah. As for the actual album, it sort of got a loose concept. The title is French for Music for Three Pregnant Women. Leclair came up with the idea during the time that his wife, as well as a few of her friends, were pregnant. And sort of hoped to create these kinds of, ambient techno pieces that evoke the moods of different times of the pregnancy. Each track is named after a different day over that whole process, like the 33rd day or the 205th day, etc. Except in French, and I can't be bothered to pronounce all the numbers in French. And yeah, it's all around pretty dang solid. Every track seamlessly flows into the next, but each one has its own distinctive identity. The atmosphere is very light and agreeable, but still pretty immersive. Can make good use of its minimalistic and stripped-back sound design and pull me in pretty well. Now, I will freely admit that despite knowing this album existed for several years, I only now just got around to listening to it for the first time in preparation for this video. I have not had the years of repeat listens that the album's biggest fans presumably have, and perhaps as such I was not exactly mind-blown by it, as someone who also listens to a lot of ambient techno and downtempo in a similar vein to this. I mean, I don't think it's going to become one of my own big all-time favorites, and honestly, I don't think it necessarily would have even been one if I had actually heard it back in 2013 or whenever I first found out about it. It absolutely did not sweep me off my feet, but neither did I think it was really trying to do that in the first place. This album doesn't really strike me as some kind of era-defining masterpiece. It just feels like this one-off low-key passion project that felt very personal to Leclair himself. And for what it is, I think it does still pretty handily cross over into great territory. It's super well constructed and put together. It's really consistent and well produced. These tracks mainly stick to the same grooves through their entire running time, with progression happening pretty slowly, if at all. But I still never at any point felt outright bored by it. Even if it would often slip into the background, I still enjoyed myself the whole way through anytime I put it on. It may be true that there are other similar sounding projects that happen to have a stronger personal connection for me, but there's really nothing I can point to specifically that I can take issue with or complain about here aside from that. I definitely understood right away why this has resonated so strongly with fans, and still occasionally gets brought up to this day among ambient techno enthusiasts. So yeah, I guess let's just go into individual tracks. The opening track is a collab with the German minimal techno outfit Zentrum, and I'll admit that I wasn't crazy about this one on first listen, but it got a little better with each repeat visit. By my third or fourth listen, it had to end up becoming one of my favorites. It's mostly just a very low-key, hazy synth pad with lots of little tapping micro-house percussion textures that slowly build up and form their own little minimalistic groove. It's fairly muted and not particularly attention-grabbing, but it's paced very well, can make 8.5 minutes feel like 5, and does a good job of setting the tone for the rest of the album. And this track seamlessly segues into the second track, the 33rd Day. I'm just gonna pronounce these in English, sorry. This one carries over all the microhouse percussion from before, but switches over into some much more skittery, bleeping rhythms, and ditching that hazy pad in favor of some other occasional textures that sound like wind blowing through a long highway tunnel. Although a different hazy synth pad does eventually get introduced a little after the 2-minute mark. There are other little blips of synth chords that feel like single streetlights passing by, or other enveloping synths that sound like string washes. Eventually, the microhouse percussion comes back, but forming totally different rhythms that sound like loads of ticking clocks. On first listen, I think I was more impressed with the segue than I was with the track itself, but it's another one that got a little better with every successive listen, and you cannot say it was lacking in progression. Every moment just feels like the logical payoff to the next one. But pretty much every texture from this track is directly built off and developed in the next one, the 64th Day. Got all the same paths and sounds and combines them with this 2-note piano loop, makes them even more emotionally resonant than they were before. Brings back that set of clockwork percussion later too, even in spite of it not really forming a coherent groove. There's like a real sense of longing anticipation created by this track, the kind of thing I could see underscoring some montage scene in a movie that's meant to symbolize like a lot of time passing. Now, while these first 3 tracks link together so seamlessly to the point of almost feeling like one big 22-minute track, the rest of the following tracks tend to feel like they stand more on their own, not really connected to each other. 85th Day breaks the streak the album built before and just delivers some glitchy ambient synth pads going over water sound effects, and some stock bird tweeting sound effects that sound pulled out of 808 State Specific State, I guess. It's pleasant and low-key, but does sort of have the feeling of like a one-off detour in the grander scheme of the track listing. Not a track I ever skip, but not one that felt like a big important moment in its own right. And 114th Day does pick things back up though, sticking to that same pleasant, low-key vibe, but with a bit more of a feeling of longing, also with more progression over time, I guess. There's a lot of like synth guitar plucking sounds and various dub techno synth textures echoing out in the distance. About 3 minutes in, there's a bouncy little micro-house beat that gets introduced and gives the track a bit more groove, and the track just slowly swells up and down from there. Oh yeah, and there's also this, like, sort of creepy sounding outro section in the last minute and a half, which just has a lot of rumbling bassy noises, little glitched up snippets of sounds that seem pulled out of various radio broadcasts, and a few other whooshing sound effects. So it's a cool little moment there, I guess. But that leads into 150th Day, and this is probably the liveliest track in the bunch. It's got a whole bunch of layers of varied synth guitar textures plucking away, got some micro house percussion coming and going too, and this track also pretty consistently throws me off, since a little before the 6-minute mark, a regular kick drum is introduced, and it's like half a beat off from where I thought the downbeat was in the rest of the track leading up to it. It's like the meter just shifts over, even though it doesn't really. It's the same effects that the Monolake track Amazon has on me. I think that I'm feeling one beat for most of it, and then some different percussion comes in to tell me, nope, you're wrong. Though I think that track actually does skip a beat, and this one does not. It's actually really difficult for me to feel the downbeat in the right place, even after the kick comes in, let alone before it happens. I've often needed to, like, pause the track in order to reorient myself. The effect is slightly disorienting, but thankfully the groove of the track itself, regardless of where the downbeat is actually supposed to be, is nicely refreshing and upbeat. It can put me in a good mood. That one confusing aspect isn't enough to prevent it from becoming a favorite, just as Amazon still stands as one of my favorite Monolake tracks ever. Anyway, we move into 180th Day. This one's a little strangely put together. Almost feels like a bunch of unrelated ideas stitched together. There's like 2 whole minutes of bubbling sound effects that sound like a pitched down washing machine or something. And then there's like this really long crossfade into like these totally different distant bell sounds and some light buzzing synth pad. And then a micro house beat just gets plopped in out of nowhere, and all the other previous elements get dropped in favor of another muted synth pad and maybe a few little tiny taps of buzzing and beeping percussion. Not one of the more riveting grooves on the album from there, and the way the whole track comes together just feels a little awkward and arbitrary, doesn't flow that well, but it is still a nice track in spite of that. Though thankfully that transitions into a much stronger cut in 205th Day, which has a much more striking and unique sounding mix, mostly made out of all these filtered synth chord licks that sound pretty cool, and being joined by a few little synth guitar plucks and then some dramatic samples of echoing piano notes. A plunky microhouse beat does come in later, oddly sounding pitched up and reversed or something, though that doesn't stop it from still forming a solid groove regardless. And I think this might be my favorite track in the bunch. Like, those piano samples really hit with a deceptive amount of impact, and the mix of sounds he implements make the track stick out from the track listing in the best possible way, without feeling out of place. This is really freaking good stuff. Now that finally brings us to the closer, the 236th Day. And this returns us to a much more straightforward micro house groove with all these bouncy, echoing, low-key dub techno synths. I will freely admit that this track did kind of strike me as a bit of an anticlimactic finish on many listens, with how simplistic it was and how muted the sound design is, especially in comparison to the penultimate track. But it does still feel mildly mood-brightening in spite of that. I wouldn't call it a favorite, but it's hardly an ineffective finish either. It's nice. And yeah, that's everything on Musique pour toi, Femmes, Enceintes. It's a pretty rock-solid collection of ambient techno and microhouse here. On first listen, I thought it was just fine. I probably could have left it at that. Again, if I'd actually bothered to listen to it, like, 8 years ago when I first heard of its existence, I likely would have given it, like, 1 listen, not really give it the time of day, and end up forgetting it exists. But I knew with how much hype this project gets from its fans that there was probably something more to it that was worth sinking more time into, and it got a little better with every successive listen and grew on me more and more, and yeah, after 6 listens or however many I've given it at this point, I think I can pretty much co-sign what other people have said about it. I have no idea whether this project is going to work for actual pregnant women, unless they happen to really like ambient techno. And while there's a non-zero chance of it, I seriously doubt I'm going to be able to get confirmation for that among those who actually watch my channel. But I digress. I still can't bring myself to say that I think this project is some kind of stone cold masterwork, or the kind of thing that I see becoming a longtime personal favorite. And for anyone who has not heard it yet, I would not call it an immediate listen. It's the kind of project that you'd probably need to both already be generally into this genre, and sink enough time into it to let it all grow on you. But I will not deny, for what it tries to accomplish, it does its job very well. It can work in the same sort of vein for me as a good Monolake album, albeit notably brighter and happier than most of his stuff. And I don't feel compelled to delete it off my iPod after this video goes up. Yeah, this is a very solid project. It's very good. And I'll give it an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.